Welcome. My name's Alexis Lowry. I'm curator here at Dia Art Foundation, and I'm really happy to have you guys all join us today for a conversation with Jessica Bell Brown and Eric Mack about Sam Gilliam. Incredibly lusciously surrounded by the work, which is the best way to talk about an artist's practice, I think. So, now you want me to use it? All right, better? All right. So, I'm particularly thrilled to have these two speakers because they're going to bring, I think, really deep perspective. Jessica Bell Brown's been working on a dissertation for the last couple of years, to which Sam features very prominently. Her research explores American painting and identity in the post-civil rights decade. And the beginning of her dissertation has an incredible title, so I'm going to read it, because I love a good title and I can never come up with one. Bad Attachments, Painting in the Post-Civil Rights Decade. So surrounded by Sam's work, I feel like that couldn't be more perfect. And Eric's work is also definitely impacted by Sam's practice, as we'll see in a couple of images later on. He works in a variety of media, from painting and installation to wall pieces, often incorporating clothing and industrial materials. He's got a show opening tomorrow. Where is it, in the Chinatown Mall?
Yeah, at Jeffrey Stark Gallery.
Jeffrey Stark Gallery. Everyone should go. 88 East Broadway. So now you can find it and go. It's up through January, right?
Yes.
Through end January. So we were saying, you don't have to run, but you have to walk with purpose so you don't miss it. Jessica very recently started working as the associate curator at the Baltimore Museum of Art. So it's a wonderful new appointment for them. They're lucky to have her. She's also been a consulting curator for Gracie Mansion, which is, I imagine, pretty cool, having never been in there. Yeah.
No, it's a really cool opportunity.
It's an amazing building, yeah. Okay, and I'll just run through some of Eric's highlights, because that is what you do when you're introducing people. Recent solo shows include, where are we? In Austerity, stripped from its supports and worn as a sarong at Power Station in Dallas. Let Me Walk Across the Room at the Brooklyn Museum, and Vogue Fabrics at the Albright Knox Museum. Mack's work was also included in the 2019 Whitney Biennial, which I hope all of you saw. And major group exhibitions include In the Abstract at Mass MoCA. At Mass MoCA, right? And Blue Black at the Pulitzer, which was an amazing show organized by Glenn Ligon there in St. Louis. And Making and Unmaking at the Camden Art Center in London. So, without further ado, thank you both so much for coming to speak to us about Sam's work. And it's on you.
Awesome.
It's to you.
Cool.
I know, right? Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alexis, and to Dia for sort of graciously hosting this conversation. Thank you to Eric.
Oh, thank you.
Right? Like, we've been in conversation for so long about Eric's work, about Sam's work, and Sam's interlocutors. So it's just really a pleasure to be here and hold space with all of these factors in place, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, this museum, this institution, it's held a lot of importance for me in the kinds of work that they show, and really a home for abstraction and conceptual practice, and there's a real consciousness in how you enter the space and engage with these materials. So it's pretty great.
Mm-hmm. So I feel so far from you, right? I'm going to turn my chair a little bit and just
get closer.
Yeah, feel the proximity.
We took the train together,
right?
so it's
And I hope this is okay with our camera.
Is it?
Oh, we're good? Okay, good. Okay. This feels better, right? Do we need to Yeah.
Cool. Excellent.
That's a really interesting analogy or metaphor for how you have to experience Sam's work, right? You have to get up close and be proximate, I think, to feel the magnetism and the magnitude of it.
Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to start off our conversation by inviting a level of description, a description of the work, this magnificent work behind us, Double Merge. And perhaps maybe we can close our eyes and think about it,
Okay.
like what we see, rather than sort of,
Right. Be like breaking our necks.
or maybe not. I don't know. So I would maybe start off by thinking about this work as a constellation of two large-scale paintings that have merged into one installation.
Yeah.
And I would maybe describe the kind of spatial interaction and the surface interaction or surface activity that's happening.
Absolutely.
So maybe the way in is to think about the way that these canvases taken together have these accent points, or these nexuses, nexi, 10 or so, creating this lovely rhythm. I would describe the index of paint being poured onto a flat surface and folding onto itself to create these kinds of marks and stains and traces.
Right. It's absolutely like choreography.
Choreography.
It's absolutely choreography. Off the wall.
Off the wall.
And then readdressing the wall. So there are these points of closure, but they end up being like varied in a way of like a prompt, like that's based on levity.
Levity, okay.
Yeah.
Say more about that, the levity.
The distance from the floor, like just, the attachment as it goes up, the kind of weightlessness that's allowed for the gesture, to inhabit the space and to like kind of reject flatness, even though it's so clearly like come from such a degree, from flatness to a degree.
Right, that the sort of the kiss of the gravity of paint and the flatness of the surface, when enfolded onto itself and hung, becomes a different kind of expression. I like to think about maybe these apexes as one expression of that levity, the hang.
Yes.
And then the way that the work literally levitates from the floor.
Right.
How would you describe Gilliam's attention to paint in this? So I feel like we're talking about the form and the composition and construction, but I wonder, like, in terms of the image quality of this, how would you describe as a painter yourself?
There's just just really thinking about a varied index. The kind of daubs that would then be kind of blotted and folded, almost like a Rorschach.
A Rorschach, yes.
And that replication ends up kind of being this structural point to this image that then kind of dissolves. And I think in certain cases, they end up becoming more attached to the materiality of the surface, in which they or absorbed more fully, becoming more like liquid and yeah.
Like a runaway effect, kind of like
Yeah.
like a chance. Maybe if there's space for a chance operation, it happens in that liquidity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Okay. So I think we have like a vocabulary with which we can sort of enter, or we have entered this work. But what I also wanted to maybe open up by thinking about 1968 and what's happening in and out of the art world at this time.
Right.
So Gilliam arrives in Washington around 1963, 62, 63, and is making his wife at the time worked for the newspaper, and he was teaching at McKinley and other places. And his painting looks so much different than this.
Yeah.
He made these geometric hard edge abstractions, which some of us might be like super familiar with. If you think about a Ken Noland or a Tom Downing, like his, I think, who am I thinking about? There's one painter who I love. Hale would have described Gilliam's early paintings as necktie paintings because they had all of these sort of stripes, and that was also a little shady.
Yeah, I think so.
Right? It was very shady, but but I think that there was something emergent in Gilliam's practice that, to me, has always sort of made him feel not a part of the Washington Color School, but adjacent to it. So that maybe those early exercises in hard edge painting were an avenue to get to this kind of spread that we see through the drapes. But a lot of that work was happening in the kind of watercolors that he was making, and where Japanese, using sort of folding Japanese paper onto itself. And it was Walter Hopps who sort of convinced him to move into experimenting in that mode through painting. So that's kind of what's happening, I think, formally in Washington, D.C. at the time. But Gilliam starts to be in conversation with people like Rockne Krebs, who was a sculptor, and was working in plastics and made these installations that had a painterly sort of Linda Banglis-like language to it, but was like definitively about an object in space and time. So that's, I guess, for those of you who might not be as familiar with Gilliam's, I guess, originary context, like there's that, but then there's also, like, 1968, MLK has been assassinated, Robert Kennedy has been assassinated, the nation's at war, DC is on fire, riots, not only DC, but LA, all across America.
Yeah.
And Gilliam is working in his studio off of U Street. So how do you think about that? Like the way the outside can seep in or into how you approach, it's like that Guston, like, how do I go back into my studio and make what I was making before when the world is crazy?
And the anxiety is like kind of unavoidable. It's just, there isn't like it kind of exists in the spirit, the unrest. And I think it serves like a particular, I think it ends up being productive for Gilliam, because I think that these kinds of jaunts into the space like end up being like a real embodiment of a kind of a mixture of a kind of a reverence and also like personhood through objecthood or something.
What?
Does that you know what I'm saying?
That's the like
Right,
that's the like
that's
personhood, a personhood, a reverence, objecthood,
Yeah.
permission.
Permission.
Let's say more about that, because
Yes.
I've always wondered how we can think about spatialized painting as a kind of pronouncement, a pronouncement of one's commitments to a medium, or maybe a pronouncement of a kind of embrace of the promiscuity of a medium, or the possibility of subverting what one expects a painting to do or be or how to behave.
Right.
And so if we like go back to that anxiety that's in the air about the social world,
Yeah.
and the anxiety that's fully accepted about what medium, what's happening in excess of a medium, what's happening in excess of painting or sculpture, and then I hate to be like to oversimplify it, but then we sort of arrive at this moment in which painting comes off of the stretcher and onto, off of the stretcher and in different types of situatedness.
Right. Yeah, I mean, he's an incredible formalist, and I feel like I feel like the most important part was to be able to communicate from that point, like as a building structure, and for me, those things are imbibed with meaning, that really do have to do with like something more particular than just taking up space, but that those things are like poetic opportunities for expression that are like autonomous and kind of separate from the kind of anxieties of representation, even though that those things are like very much attached to the work, and certain points should be attached to the work. In thinking about, he titled one of the works like after the date that
April 4th.
April 4th, right, 1968.
Yeah.
And then really thinking about like the embodiment of a day, like the openness also of that, but as a place where he's either in his studio on that day, or he's and he's still a being in the world, and he's still like it's still like quite political, it's still quite raw. So just like the naming and the unnaming of it, I think allows. There's some really interesting like texture to it.
Yeah, I think what we're talking around too is the facticity of who Sam Gilliam is and was at that moment. And so if you were a painter or an artist making non-representational work at that time, when there was this sort of cultural call to represent, then you, I think, were situated quite precariously within a community of Black cultural producers, right? Like you were not conversant with the radical politics of the time.
Yeah, right.
And so to sort of hedge against that, like to be deeply aware of with every fiber of your being, and to sort of not be conscripted within a system that tries to sort of narrow you down. Like that to me is just absolutely courageous and convicted and mind-blowing, and I still struggle with how to think through that or how to write through it. That's why my project is called Bad Attachments, because it's about sort of not conceding to a camp and sort of being a Black artist, but also undoing the expectations on Black artists.
Right.
And I don't necessarily know if that that situation has really shifted since then for artists now, to this expectation to sort of navigate. Yeah.
I mean, it seems like it's still. I mean, just the presence of the work, you can feel that these things are still active questions, and they have so much vitality in terms of like what the possibility of like meaning making is like, within the language of abstraction. Mm-hmm. I mean, but for me, my project has always been about like that these formal properties have ethics. They have an ethic and has like a political power, down to the way that the kind of freedom of the canvas being unprimed and allowing for the material to like really soak in and change the meaning of like a simple drop cloth or a simple cotton duck canvas. I mean, the belief that of transcendence is quite a political like position. And I feel like it ends up having these like modernist dimensions, but I think that the belief, I mean, you can feel it in the work.
Yeah, it's like we touched on or landed on the word pronouncement, and to pronounce is to profess or to speak, but it's to be pronounced means to be salient, to be visible, or to sort of be, I think, to be present, or to sort of announce one's sense of presence. And so this work, just the sheer verticality of it and the spread of it and the volume of it, the quickness of the stain, like that speed of this work speaks. It's like this heteroglossia to me. Mm-hmm. I think about the fold as a way to hedge against the knowingness of geometry and of space. Mm-hmm. The fold is something that's accidental, that is imprecise, that's hard to replicate.
Right.
It also refers, I think, Sam Gilliam had, when he sort of made this shift from the hard-edged geometrical paintings to the drapes and the cowls and pieces like this, I remember him recalling that he looked outside and saw a sheet or a curtain hanging on a clothesline. Yeah. And so that vocabulary of the everyday comes into a language of modernist painting, and he's sort of making space for the fold. Right. But then that also gets conscripted in, if you think about Giotto and like sort of Renaissance painting and the Giotto sort of use of color, mm-hmm. and drapery becomes this other dimension too that we can sort of see through time. And so there's an intentionality in this work, I think, the languages of it to speak to like the history of painting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing that really surprised me here, we talked about it a little bit earlier, just being struck by the selvage edge of both of the works. Like seeing this
I'm going to move out of the way because you can
stitched
see it really
line
prominently here.
here is like this point of when the canvas has been woven and it's taut in such a, or it's woven in such a way to keep the fibers from fraying at the edge. But it ends up being like this really interesting formatting point for the undulations that happen, the points of repetition, the points of where it kind of jaunts into another point. But I mean, literally, like it being this kind of unexpected relationship to the wall, you know, kind of having this like psychedelic, you know, orthogonal line, you know, just like perspective that ends up just kind of creating this amazing focal point. I was so struck by that as like this quality and thinking about how it kind of captures the space, you know.
I feel like this is a good time to bring in the images of a project that Eric did at the Desert X Biennial.
Okay. Well, right.
And this is a project called Halter. Can you describe?
Yeah.
Was that the only image, the first one?
I think the first one. I thought there were two, but it's fine.
They were two of the same.
Okay. God bless. Yeah.
Okay, so this is the Whitney Biennial, the work that was in the Whitney Biennial, but the first image of the installation around an abandoned gas station
Yes.
is what we...
Totally. Yeah. I mean, so this work, it's basically an oversized fabric collage, and these mended fabrics that were this beautiful donation from the Masoni family, and it's this beautiful like knitted fabric that allows for this kind of transparency, and they're kind of gathered in. There's these channels that structure the piece like a drawstring. The rope goes through it and then wraps around with the gas station sign. So I was really kind of emphasizing, because of the kind of disparate rhythms of the colors, the patterns, the prints, their orientation in the collage as a whole. I was trying to emphasize at the very last gesture, like to emphasize their total movement and their like kind of collective intentionality. So I thought about the kind of apparatus of a garment, a kind of garment for the building. So I thought about the halter top as this gesture of suspension as well as like dimensionality. And so, yeah, the basis of this work is working with the site and thinking about transparency, the transparency of the fabric, that wouldn't diminish what the sight line is and how it kind of interacts as a collaborator to the gas station and to this Coachella Valley as a whole. But yeah.
I think about about the phenomenological imprint of this work in this space, that work in that particular context. And in a way, I think what you and Gilliam do quite beautifully is point us back to the world in which we live. Bring us back to our bodies in space, in time. And to create, I think what you're continuing in his legacy is creating some more openings for what painting can be.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of history of the materiality is so important, just as important as like its potential. But like the fact that just in thinking about cloth in relationship to the body and that history of labor and in thinking about this potential to like embrace a building, and that these folds and undulations are about a kind of measured understanding, you know, and not in a not in a literal way, but as a kind of a document of flourishes, so to speak.
That's so beautiful.
Thanks.
I'm stealing that.
Cool. You can have that.
I'll credit you.
Yeah, it's cool.
No, yeah.
Whatever you want to do.
So as you're describing the activity of Halter, there's a way in which it maps so beautifully onto work that we don't see here, but is, I think, like this, like Double Merge goes part and parcel with works that Gilliam had done on the sides of museum structures, like the Philadelphia Art Museum, the seahorses.
Absolute favorite work.
Right?
I love that work. Yeah.
I wish I had included an image of it, but just imagine a painting sort of behaving like a sculptural relief, and such expansive scale that even that we're just dwarfed in the presence of it, as like in terms of human bodies. If any of you were in Venice a few years ago, Gilliam had work on the edifice of one of the major structures in the Giardini, and that even though that work at that time was sort of made, 2015, yet made for that. You know, there's a kind of consistency in the language of painting and spatial intervention that he that was cultivated through work like this, and even through those watercolors on those works on paper that were folded onto themselves. I also want to talk about communities, because it's really prescient for Gilliam to be here at Dia in conversation with artists who were of his time as well, and that he thought about, like Judd and Morris, and Truitt, who he was quite proximate to, Anne Truitt, who was quite proximate to in D.C. And so when I look at this work, I think about people like Rockne Krebs and Ed McGowan, and I think about Morris and the felt pieces and the sort of hang of that work. And I wonder, like, how would you map Gilliam into, I guess, a recent history of making, but also who would you love to see him in context with now?
Yeah. It's interesting because the first time in grad school, I kind of really embraced my Washington School of Colorfield School, and there was so much permission that I got from Gilliam, but one of my professors, Peter Halley, was actually taught by Sam in, I feel like it was like LSU in like Louisiana, I believe. I need to clarify that. Fact check, I will. But he spoke a lot about his just some of the gifts that Sam was able to give him, in terms of like in thinking about color as a huge point. thinking about the neons and thinking about the like metallics, and I mean, and also pairing that with these more organic, neutral, like warm browns and grays and points like that. And those things end up being this like a refreshing take on the push and pull Hans Hofmann school, a real take on the New York school. So yeah, I mean, that was the most unlikely kind of constellation for me, but it was super. There was some like kind of firsthand information that I got from Peter in that regard. And I mean, imagining like one of Peter's cell paintings on this wall, I mean, in relationship to that, or really thinking about them in relationship to the work in the front, the beveled edge painting. I mean, those kinds of dimensions and points of communication within the formal frameworks of the paintings. There's a lot of things shared.
Yeah, I would put him. I would probably. So I would sort of maybe work my way from the inside out. So I would maybe situate him. I feel like there's not enough attention paid to that 1968, 1969 DC moment. So New York really just dominates histories of art in that time period, and I think that there's it's ripe for to sort of mapping on to the kind of the communities that were conversant with one another in that moment. So Ed McGowan, Downing was a big impact on Gilliam. Alma Thomas, they corresponded.
Right.
I would put her in there for sure.
Yeah.
And then I would sort of bring in like Tuttle,
Yeah.
right? I would bring in Claude Viollat and the sort of support surface
Absolutely.
movement, which sort of directly quotes Sam as a point of influence. I would put you in there, Rauschenberg,
Okay.
Morris.
What about oh my God, Stephen Perino?
How would you map that?
Well, a leap, but but just really thinking about the objects themselves, like kind of having this kind of disembodied conversation. I feel like just the turning and but still actually having the radicality of the canvas and the stretcher, the support being present. Just like a kind of attitude, like communicated through these like more traditional, like the shape canvas, I feel like that brings in a lot of.
It does. I mean, that puts us in Ed Clark territory,
Right.
too.
Right.
The evolution of shape, or the shape of shape, if anyone has seen sort of Amy Silman's MoMA
I'll have to see that.
artist choice presentation. I'm just tremendously excited for what Gilliam here means for how we can sort of rethink that decade, but also there's so many young artists who come through Dia, so many artists who come through Dia, and so to sort of see that touch, or to sort of be able to experience a manifestation of that touch of practices later on is just super exciting to me.
Absolutely, yeah.
I want to open it up to questions or comments from the audience, should there be any. Observations, questions, comments, all of that is welcome. Can I give you the mic? Oh, thank you, Alexis. You're on it.
In either one of your research, have you ever met Sam and had conversations with him about his work and the history of it and these things?
Yes, I have. We've done a studio visit together, and it was actually after I had gone through the entirety of his holdings in the Smithsonian, American Art Archives. And so it was really fruitful to be able to sort of have a way into the conversation around the work that's not getting him to sort of rehash how the story of his practice is told. But I'm just tremendously grateful that that happened, 5 years ago, 6 years ago? Because he is older and, that's a real, memory or the kind of hyperspecificity of the ways in which one can sort of recall the particularities around the practice, that, has a rapid, that ability can sort of just be taken away from you very quickly. It happens quicker than what we'd like to.
Right.
So the urgency of seeing a return to that work, his work, it's felt. It's not taken lightly.
Absolutely. Yeah, I met him in February, and that was just happenstance after the Desert X work was finished. I was in LA, and it just so happened the day that I landed, his opening at David Kordansky was taking place later on that evening. So I was like, okay, of course I have to be there. And he was sitting in a chair and in the middle of the gallery and was just holding court. And I was like, just kind of freaking out a little bit. He wasn't too impressed. He was like, okay, it's nice to meet you. So, all right. Okay, well, let me look at this work, So, but I was seeing him, I don't know. It was just as important for me, and hopefully he and I can have some more conversation. I hope.
I have a question for both of you. I've always thought of Gilliam's work as very joyful, and it's not until today that I'm looking up and thinking about these parts of it that look like nooses and the hanging and the historical connotations of that. Sorry, I get nervous talking in front of people. So in your research, have you found where the artist speaks about the somberness of that connotation? And then, Eric, in your work, how do you grapple with those connotations and the hanging in the work that you do?
In what I found, he was resistant to the noose interpretation, and I don't know if that's a strategic resistance or if it's if it's indeed just not. I think when you look at his practice holistically, it's about expansion, and I think about his abstinence from overt politicized gestures, then it I think reaffirms my reluctance to narrow it down in that narrow that gesture down into that way. But I think it's inevitable if to sort of identify that form and to come to terms with it.
I'm so surprised by the fact that they are, having read that they are leather.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're tied with skins in a sense, and so there's some kind of interesting scale shift about that, like a hide just turned into rope or something, and I think maybe that just would allude to a possibility for some real complication in that reading, as a point of detail, or that it ends up maybe not being so literal, or not being an end point, but maybe being an opening to a gesture that's handheld, just this apparatus that's really very much of the hand, the gesture of the hand, and not one of that specifically signifies Sam's touch, you know, but maybe one that anybody could take part in, you know, a very accessible one, like tying your shoe or something like that. I mean, that's my point of legibility as far as that's concerned. What was your question for me?
Somber.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of, I end up being very particular about like what, like within my own intentionality that I want to work to communicate. And it really does have a lot to do with like flight and kind of more of like my projection about choreography in a sense. Really thinking about the freedom, a disembodied freedom, or one that's like maybe that's after the body. I mean, there's a lot that I put into the material identity of the work, like right from the start, you know, before, like when I'm buying it at the store, you know, like I feel like the work begins at that point. And that's a little bit of like my kind of fascination with the selvage like line, that it's not hemmed, but it ends up being an affirmation from the loom. I'm like, the work is beginning, and you know, it ends up corresponding with the seam of the floor, and I just, that kind of having a kind of a beautiful silence or something, you know, to it that is very much within the work. Yeah, I try to get free. I'm trying to like really, yeah, that's the work.
I think that's so resonant to like how Gilliam's work, it gratifies different vantage points, and there's a kind of lack of certainty, you know, or assuredness, because as soon as you take a step to the left or a step to the right or a step back or forward, your whole perspective just shifts. And so that kind of choreography is just really interesting to me. Like, if you think about this fold that's right behind us, that is a consequence of these two gathering points, and then immediately sort of underneath this sort of convex, this space there, you see different marks or folds that are about paint indexing itself onto a surface, not about the kind of shadow effect of, you know, emptiness and volume. And so there's a kind of, is this or is this that happening in how you look at this work? It's so rich and errant.
Yeah, absolutely.
That creates a kind of freedom.
Yeah, I wanted to be ready to talk about like the floor as a place to like, as a site for painting, you know, and then I realized like in looking at it, it's like, it's definitely not just that. Like it ends up being like, you know, how the paint falls and like in like full absorption, you know, and the blotting, of course, happens on the floor, but then, you know, all of these things like the crumpling and like, you know, the process, but just imagining this object having gone through all of these things and then for the hanging to be, it's like in almost defiance of those signals, you know, really, there's so much poetry in that formality for me, yeah.
We have one question in the back, and then a second question in the second row.
All right, we're going to go to the back first.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that I think about a lot when I look at Sam's work is kind of these textural aspects that I think you guys were kind of getting to a little bit with the folds. I always have this impulse to touch it, which I don't, but I think I do think about it a lot. And then looking at your own work, Eric, which I'm not very familiar with, but kind of did a quick perusal of, there's of course this incorporation of clothing and textiles, and so this blending of material and texture that actually is reminiscent of like quilting to me, like the G's Bend quilts, where they're kind of taking these different scraps of clothing and creating these quilts out of them. And so I'm just hoping you guys can talk a little bit about this textural aspect that perhaps is just related to me and my own impulses, but I do think is present in your work a little bit.
Cool.
Let's talk about paint, because I think
Paint.
it's a question about like how do you arrive at these different effects that create those different registers. So acrylic paint it's plastic.
Right.
And it offers, it has a lot of give to it. It allows things to dry quickly. It allows things to dissolve. I don't know. Why am I talking about paint? You're the artist.
Sorry. Yeah, I was like, I wanted to hear talk about paint.
Right, but and Gilliam adds like this for the water breaker solution, which is a technique taken actually from Frankenthaler and Lewis, that creates more of a even more liquidity in
Staining process,
for it. But that's all I'm gonna say.
But like, so I don't have the time, right? But I'm trying to figure out the invention of acrylic paint. I mean, when was that? Like, it was like the early 60s?
Early 60s.
Yeah. So, I mean, in relationship to this, I mean, it's like new technology. This ends up being like this, this kind of like evidence on the surface that, it doesn't have to be like enclosed by like a sizing that structures the surface of the canvas, but it's like allowing to breathe, and because in itself it's just like plastic, and I think before, oil would not be able to do this, and it would create this kind of rigid, like heavy point, but the fact that it could have this like almost this dyed effect. I mean, I use dye. I also, from time to time, use bleach to like deal with what's there and to kind of reveal what's under the pigment. And that ends up really straining a lot of the materiality. But to not encumber the materiality, not to encumber the painting with like undue weight, would allows for this kind of like visual weightlessness, but also like something that's like physical. There's that correspondence there. I mean, for like when I saw Sam Gilliam's retrospective at the Corcoran, I feel like it was like 2004.
2003, 2004.
Right. And like maybe 3 years after that, there was the Morris Lewis show at the Hirshhorn, and then those shows were like completely mind-blowing, but like kind of reached back to one another and like kind of spoke about like this paint's confrontation with like the everyday, not encumbered by these overt like frameworks, but like a kind of allowance either in scale or that to kind of negotiate real surface, like real haptics, and the fact that there were so many kind of mysteries there's so many mysteries like in seeing like how this paint is applied and the kind of tools that he used, and that it was not just his hand or a simple brush, but the surface ends up being this record of like a number of, I I can imagine him just being like, in that photo of him, like, just covered in paint all over, you know. It's like he probably like, you know, laid on the canvas, you know, at some point.
His
But
aviator glasses and his little afro.
Right,
and then
right.
just, he's so serious, and I think
Right.
there's one with like a cigarette in one hand, and he's got all this paint on him, and the
Right.
work behind him. It's just like loaded with symbology. Like, yeah.
yeah.
We had a question in the second row, or comment.
And the comment was to thank you both for such poetic insights into the work, which I very much appreciated. You answered my second question, that something about the relationship to Morris Louis, which to me seemed, I don't know if they had a personal relationship, or was it just time and place connected? And the last question was just about this is now called Merge, but it was originally Carousel. And I think that is evocative in so many other ways, too. So I wonder if you would have any comments about it.
The carousels were the first sets of detached paintings that he created in terms of like intentionally sort of working within a space and sort of moving it from the beveled edge paintings to the drapes and the cowls, which were more sort of small scale and consequential to this kind of work. But yeah, the carousel as this menagerie of moving images, you know, maybe, yes, and yeah. He did look at a lot of Morris Louis. I think if you were a painter in DC at that time, that group
Yeah.
was vital and
Absolutely.
prescient and the only way, you know, for so long. And even now, I think there's this, I think, forgetfulness around the way that Gilliam and his crew, they were kind of like the enfant terrible of DC, you know, sort of being bad and making different types of aesthetic decisions and choices. And so there's a great reverence, but also a kind of, okay, let's move the conversation forward, too.
And Lewis would have been passed more. Gilliam moves in 63, right? So Lewis has already also passed away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Tom Downing, I think
Yeah.
they may have had also, no, Nolan had passed away, but Downing was the figure who was really the linchpin between Gilliam and that, you know, post-painterly abstract crew.
Right.
Well, with that, I want to thank you both so much for coming and for sharing your incredible insights. And thank you all for joining us. And thank you, Dan and Kathleen and all of Dia's team for making it happen.
Awesome.
Thank you, Dia.